I was standing in my office on the 42nd floor, looking at the city skyline when my assistant knocked and said, "There are 4 people here to see you. They say it's urgent, and they're asking about Ethan," and my heart stopped because no one knew about Ethan. No one knew that every morning for the past 6 months, I'd been meeting a 24-year-old homeless kid at the coffee shop on 5th Street and buying him breakfast and sitting with him for 30 minutes before I went to work. And no one knew that those 30 minutes had become the only part of my day I actually looked forward to. And now someone was here asking about him. And when I turned around and walked to the reception area, I saw them a woman in her 60s with perfectly coiffed silver hair, wearing a Chanel suit, and behind her stood 4 men in dark suits carrying briefcases. And she looked at me with these cold, assessing eyes and said, "You must be Caroline Chen." And I said, "I am, and who are you?" And she said, "I'm Margaret Whitmore, and I believe you've been spending time with my nephew Ethan." And the way she said spending time made it sound dirty, made it sound like I was doing something wrong. And I said, "I've been helping him, yes." And she said, "Helping him or using him?" And I said, "Excuse me." And she said, "Miss Chen, I'm here because my nephew has come into a substantial inheritance, and I have reason to believe you've been manipulating him, positioning yourself to take advantage of his situation." And I felt like I'd been slapped because this woman, this stranger, was standing in my office, accusing me of something so far from the truth it was almost laughable. Except I couldn't laugh because one of the lawyers stepped forward and handed me a cease and desist letter and said, "We're advising you to stop all contact with Ethan Whitmore immediately." And I looked at that paper at Ethan's full name, Ethan Whitmore, which I'd never known. And I said, "I don't understand what inheritance. What are you talking about?" And Margaret said, "Don't play stupid with me, Miss Chen. You knew exactly who he was." And I said, I met him 6 months ago at a coffee shop. He was hungry. I bought him breakfast. That's all." And she said, "That's all," she repeated with such venom. And one of the lawyers said, "Miss Chen, we have documentation showing a pattern of contact between you and Mr. Whitmore. And given the significant age difference and power imbalance, we're prepared to pursue legal action if you don't cease contact immediately." And I just stood there feeling the ground shifting under me because 6 months ago, I'd been sitting in that same coffee shop at 6:30 in the morning, like I did every morning, because I couldn't sleep, because I'd been a widow for 2 years, and sleep still felt like betraying David, my husband, who died of a heart attack at 53 while we were on vacation in Bali, and I'd been running his company. Our company, the tech firm we'd built together for 20 years. And I was good at it. I was a good CEO, but I was also 52 years old and so tired, so unbearably tired of waking up alone in our too big house and going to an office where everyone looked at me with pity or ambition, and no one saw me as just Caroline. And that morning 6 months ago, I'd been sitting in my usual corner booth, drinking my usual black coffee, checking my usual emails, when this kid walked in, and I noticed him because he looked rough, like he'd been sleeping. Outside, his clothes were dirty, his hair was tangled, and he had this lost look in his eyes, and he went to the counter and asked if they had any day-old pastries, anything they were going to throw away. And the barista said no. "We don't do that." And the kid just nodded and turned to leave, and something in me broke because I'd seen that look before, that resignation, that acceptance of hunger. And I said, "Wait." And he turned, and I said, "Sit down. I'll buy you breakfast." And he looked at me suspicious and said, "I don't need charity." And I said, "It's not charity. I'm buying myself breakfast anyway. And I could use the company, And he hesitated, but hunger won. And he sat down, and ordered him eggs and toast and bacon and orange juice and coffee. And when the food came, he ate like he hadn't eaten in days, which he probably hadn't. And I said, "I'm Caroline." And he said, "Ethan." And I said, "Do you live around here?" And he said, "I live everywhere, nowhere." And I said, "You're homeless." And he said, "I'm between situations," and something about the way he said it with dignity, despite everything, made me like him. And I said, "How old are you?" And he said, 24. And I said, "You're young to be on the streets." And he said, "Yeah, well, life doesn't always go according to plan." And I said, "No, it doesn't." And we sat in silence for a while, and then he said, "Thank you for breakfast." And I said, "You're welcome." And he left, and I thought that would be it. But the next morning, he was there again, sitting on the curb outside the coffee shop. And when he saw me, he stood up like he'd been waiting, and I said, "Are you hungry?" And he nodded, and we went inside, and I bought him breakfast again. And we talked more this time. He told me he'd been kicked out of his house 2 years ago when he came out as gay. His father couldn't handle it, and his mother sided with his father. And he'd been surviving on his own ever since, doing odd jobs, sleeping in shelters when he could. And I told him about David, about how I'd lost him, and how the company felt like a monument to a dead man, and how I didn't know who I was anymore without him. And Ethan listened, really listened in a way. No one had listened to me in 2 years, and that became our routine. Every morning at 6:30, I'd meet Ethan at the coffee shop, and I'd buy him breakfast, and we'd talk. And slowly, he started to clean up a little. I gave him money for a gym membership so he could shower, and I bought him some new clothes, and I helped him get a job at a bookstore near my office. And he was smart. God, he was so smart. He'd read everything. And he had opinions about art and literature and philosophy, and talking to him made me feel alive again. Made me feel like I was more than just the grieving widow, more than just the CEO. I never told anyone about him. Not my assistant, not my friends, not my adult daughter, Amy, who lived in Boston with her family. Because I knew how it would look, a 52-year-old woman spending time with a 24-year-old homeless kid. People would assume things. They'd say I was having a midlife crisis or worse. And maybe I was, maybe this was my crisis. But it didn't feel like a crisis. It felt like survival. Like Ethan was the one thing keeping me tethered to the world. And then one morning, about 4 months in, we were sitting in our usual booth, and Ethan said, "Can I ask you something?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "Why do you do this? Why do you help me?" And I said, "Because I can." And he said, "That's not a real answer." And I said, "Okay, the real answer is because helping you helps me. Because when I'm with you, I don't feel so alone." And he said, "I don't feel alone either when I'm with you." And our eyes met, and something passed between us. Something I'd been trying to ignore for weeks. And I looked away first because I couldn't go there. I couldn't let myself feel what I was starting to feel. And I said, "I should get to work." And he said, "Okay." I left, but that moment stayed with me all day. And that night, I lay in bed thinking about Ethan, thinking about the way he looked at me and the way I wanted him to keep looking at me. And I told myself I was being ridiculous, that this was just loneliness making me project feelings onto a kind young man. But the next morning when I saw him waiting outside the coffee shop, my heart did this stupid leap. And I knew I was in trouble. And over the next 2 months, the tension between us grew. Every accidental touch felt electric. Every prolonged glance felt loaded. And I Started dressing differently in the mornings, putting on makeup, caring about how I looked. And I told myself it was just self-care, that I was finally taking care of myself again. But I knew the truth. I was dressing for Ethan, and then one morning he wasn't there, and I waited for 30 minutes thinking he was late. But he never showed, and panic set in. Because what if something happened? What if he was hurt or sick or worse, and I didn't have his phone number? I didn't know where he lived. I had no way to find him. And I went to the bookstore where he worked and asked for him, and they said, he didn't come in today. And I left my number and said, if he shows up, please have him call me. And I went to work, but I couldn't focus. I kept checking my phone, and finally at 3 p.m, he called and said, I'm sorry I didn't make it this morning. I wasn't feeling well, and relief flooded through me. And I said, where are you? And he said, I'm at the shelter. And I said, which one? And he told me. And I said, I'm coming. And he said, you don't have to. And I said, I want to. And I left work early, something I never did, and I drove to this rundown shelter in a part of the city I never went to. And I found Ethan in a small room with bunk beds, and he looked terrible. He had a fever, and he was shaking, and I said, you need to see a doctor, and he said, I can't afford a doctor. And I said, I don't care. I'm taking you. And he said, Caroline, you've already done too much. And I said, let me decide what's too much. And I took him to an urgent care clinic and paid for his visit, and they said he had the flu and gave him antibiotics. And I said, you can't go back to that shelter. You need rest. And he said, I'll be fine. And I said, no, you won. Come stay at my house. And he said, what? And I said, I have a guest room. You can stay there until you're better. And he said, Caroline, that's not appropriate. And I said, I don't care about appropriate. I care about you being okay. And do. He looked at me for a long moment. And then he said, okay. And if you're still watching this and wondering how a successful CEO ends up inviting a homeless 24-year-old to live in her house, I need you to understand that. By that point, it wasn't about charity or kindness. It was about need. I needed him there. I needed to take care of him. Because taking care of him meant I wasn't just going through the motions of life. I was actually living. And so, Ethan came home with me to my 5-bedroom house in the suburbs. And I showed him to the guest room and I said, theirs is a bathroom attached. Help yourself to whatever you need. And he said, thank you. And I said, you're welcome. And that night, I made him soup and we sat in my kitchen. And he said, this is a really nice house. And I said, thank you, David. And I designed it together. And he said, you must miss him. And I said, every day, but being around you makes it hurt less. And he said, why? And I said, because you remind me that life keeps going even when you don't want it to. And he said, you remind me of that too. And we smiled at each other. And I felt something shift, something settle. And Ethan, for a week, recovering from the flu, and during that week, we fell into this domestic routine I'd make. Breakfast before work. And he'd still be sleeping, and I'd leave him a note telling him there was food in the fridge. And then he'd text me during the day, telling me about his day at the bookstore. And I'd come home, and he'd have made dinner. Simple things like pasta or stir fry. And we'd eat together and talk and watch movies. And it felt so normal, so easy, like we'd been doing this forever. And on the 7th day, when he was fully recovered, he said, I should probably go. And I said, why? And he said, because this isn't real, Caroline. This is your house, your life. And I said, you're just what? And he said, I'm nobody. And I said, you're not. nobody or Ethan, and that matters to me. And he said, why does it matter so much? And I said, because you see me not the CEO, not the widow, but me, Caroline, and no one else does that anymore. And he said, I see you because you let me. And I said, then stay a little longer. And he said, okay. And he stayed another week, and then another. And somewhere in the third week, I realized he wasn't staying in the guest room because he was recovering. He was staying because neither of us wanted him to leave. And that's when things got complicated, because I'd started to feel things I had no business feeling. I'd watch him reading on the couch, and my chest would ache. I'd catch him looking at me, and my skin would flush. And one night we were washing dishes together, and our hands touched in the soapy water, and we both froze, and I pulled away and said, I should finish this. And he said, okay. And he left the kitchen, and I stood there gripping the counter, trying to calm my racing heart, because I was 52 years old, and I was having feelings for a 24-year-old kid who'd been homeless 3 months ago. And this was insane. And the next morning at breakfast, Ethan said, we need to talk. And I said, okay. And he said, I think I should move out. And I said, why? And he said, because I'm starting to feel things I shouldn't feel. And I said, what kind of things? And he said, Caroline, you know what kind? And I said, say it. And he said, I'm falling for you. And I said, you can't. And he said, I know that, but I am anyway. And I said, Ethan, I'm 28 years older than you. And he said, I don't care. And I said, I'm your employer, kind of. I'm the person who helps you. People would say, I'm taking advantage. And he said, are you taking advantage? And I said, no, but that's how it would look. And he said, then we'll keep it between us. And I said, keep what between us? We can't do this. And he said, why not? And I said, because it's wrong. Because you're vulnerable. Because I have power over you. Because this could ruin both of us and end. He said, or it could save us. And I said, you don't know what you're saying. And he said, yes, I do, Caroline. I've thought about nothing else for months. And I said, so have I. But that doesn't mean we should act on it. And he said, what if I want to act on it? And I said, Ethan, please don't make this harder than it already is. And he said, harder than what? And I said, harder than walking away. And he said, then don't walk away. And I said, I have to. And I stood up and left for work. And I didn't come home until late. And when I got there, Ethan was asleep on the couch, and I stood there looking at him. And I wanted so badly to wake him to tell him. I felt it too, but instead, I went to my room and I cried because I was tired of doing the right thing. I was tired of being responsible and careful and appropriate, and the next day, Ethan acted like nothing had happened, and so did I, and we went back to our routine. But the tension was over. Every moment felt charged with everything we weren't saying. And then, one night, 2 weeks later, I was in my home office working late, and Ethan knocked on the door and said, can I come in? And I said, sure. And he sat down and said, I've been thinking. And I said, about what? And he said, about us. And I said, there is no us. And he said, bullshit. And I said, excuse me. And he said, Caroline, I know you feel this too. I see the way you look at me. And I said, I look at you like a friend. And he said, no, you don't. And he stood up and walked around my desk, and I said, what are you doing? And he said something I should have done weeks ago. And he kissed me. And I should have pushed him away. I should have said, no, this is wrong. But instead, I kissed him back, and it was everything I'd been denying wanting. And when we broke apart, I said, "We can't do this." And he said, "We just did." And I said, "Ethan, I'm serious. This isn't he." Kissed me again. And this time I didn't protest. And that night we crossed a line we'd been dancing around for months. And afterwards, lying in my bed, I said, "This changes everything." And he said, "I know." And I said, "People can't know about this." And he said, "I know." And I said, "I don't know how to do this." And he said, "Neither do I, but I want to try." And I said, "Okay." And we did. We tried. We kept our relationship secret. I was still his friend and benefactor in public. But in private, we were something more. And for 3 months, I was happier than I'd been. In years, Ethan made me laugh, made me feel young, made me feel desired. And I fell in love with him. Not because he was young, but because he saw me in a way no one else did. And I think he loved me too, though neither of us said it out loud. And then that morning, Margaret Whitmore showed up with her lawyers and destroyed everything, and standing there in my office with that cease and desist letter in my hand, I said, "I need to talk to Ethan." And Margaret said, "Absolutely not." And I said, "You can stop me." And she said, "Actually, I can. He's under my guardianship now." And I said, "He's 24. He doesn't need a guardian." And she said he does when he's about to inherit $47 million. And the world tilted, because $47 million. And she said, "My sister Ethan's mother died 3 months ago, and she left everything to him in a trust that he can access at 25, which is in 2 months. And I've been looking for him for weeks. And when I finally found him, I discovered he's been living with you." And I said, "He's been staying with me as a friend." And she said, "Ms. Chen, I've done my research. I know about your morning meetings. I know he's been living in your house for months. I know about your relationship." And I felt sick, because how did she know? And she said, "I hired a private investigator." And I said, "That's an invasion of privacy." And she said, "I was protecting my nephew's interests." And I said, "From what?" "From me helping him." And she said, "From you exploiting him." And I said, "I never asked him for money. I didn't even know he had money." And she said, "That's convenient, but I don't believe you." And one of the lawyers said, "Ms. Chen, we have evidence that you've been engaging in a romantic relationship with Mr. Whitmore. And given the circumstances, we believe this constitutes elder abuse and financial manipulation." And I laughed. I actually laughed. Because elder abuse, I said, "I'm 52, not 85. And the lawyer said, "You're 28 years older than him. You have significantly more life experience, financial resources, and social power. That's a power imbalance." And I said, "He's an adult. He made his own choices." And Margaret said, "Did he? Or did you manipulate a vulnerable homeless man into a relationship so you could access his inheritance?" And I said, "I didn't know about any inheritance." And she said, "Prove it." And I couldn't, because how do you prove you didn't know something? And Margaret said, "I'm giving you one chance. Miss Chen, walk away. Now sign this agreement, promising no further contact, and we'll drop this quietly. But if you refuse, we'll go to court, and we'll make this very public. And I'll make sure everyone knows what you did." And I said, "What I did was help someone who needed help." And she said, "You took advantage of a traumatized young man." And I said, "No, I fell in love with him." And the words hung in the air, and Margaret's face hardened. And she said, "That's disgusting." And I said, "Love isn't disgusting." And she said, "Love," she scoffed. "He's young enough to be your son." And I said, "But he's not my son. He's a grown man, and he has the right to choose who he wants to be with." And she said, "Not when that choice is being influenced by someone with power over him." And I said, I don't have power over him. And she said, you have everything, money, security, a home, and he has nothing. Of course he'd be grateful. Of course he'd confuse gratitude with love. And I said, you don't know what you're talking about. And she said, then let me talk to him. Let me ask him directly if he wants this relationship or if he felt obligated. And I said, fine, let's ask him where more. Is he? And she said, he's at my hotel and he's agreed to stay with me until this is resolved. And I said, he agreed. Or you forced him. And she said, I'm his family and Miss Chen. You're just a woman who took advantage of his situation. And I said, get out. And she said, excuse me. And I said, get out of my office now. And she smiled this cold, triumphant smile and said, we'll be in touch. And she left with her lawyers. And I stood there shaking with rage and fear because Ethan was with her. And I didn't know if he was okay, or if he wanted to see me, or if he believed her lies, and I tried calling him. But his phone went straight to voicemail, and I tried texting but got no response. And I drove to every hotel in the city looking for Margaret Whitmore. But I couldn't find her. And finally at midnight, I went home and the house felt empty wrong without Ethan. And I realized I didn't just love him, I needed him. And 2 days passed with no word. And I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything except where he was and if he was okay. And then on the third day, my doorbell rang and I opened it. And there was Ethan, and he looked terrible, dark circles. Under his eyes, clothes rumpled. And he said, can I come in? And I said, of course. And he came in and stood in my living room. And I said, are you okay? And he said, no, I'm not okay. And I said, what did she tell you? And he said, everything she told me about the inheritance, about the lawyers, about how you're supposedly manipulating me. And I said, Ethan, I swear I didn't know about any inheritance. And he said, I know. And I said, you believe me? And he said, of course. I believe you, Caroline. I know you. And I know you would never. And I said, then why didn't you call me? Why did you stay with her? And he said, because she's right. And I said, what? And he said, not about you manipulating me. That's bullshit. But she's right that there's a power imbalance. She's right that I came into this relationship with nothing, and you had everything. And what if she's right that I confused gratitude with love? And I said, do you believe that? And he said, I don't know. I don't know what I believe anymore. And I said, Ethan, look at me. Do you love me? And he said, yes. And I said, but what? And he said, but what if I only love you because you saved me? What if I only love you? I was so desperate for someone to see me that I latched onto the first person who was kind. And I said, is that what you think happened? And he said, I don't know, maybe. And I said, okay, then let me ask you something. When did you start having feelings for me? And he said, I don't know, maybe 2 months in. And I said, 2 months in, I'd been helping you for 2 months. You already had a job, a place to shower new clothes. You weren't desperate anymore, so why did you start having feelings for me then? And he said, because I started seeing you, not just the woman who helped me, but you, Caroline, who you really were. And I said, exactly. And he said, but what about you? Why do you love me? And I said, because you make me feel alive, because you see me as more than a widow or a CEO, because when I'm with you, I'm just myself. And he said, but I'm so much younger. And I said, I know. And he said, and people will judge us. And I said, I know. And he said, and my aunt will make this hell. And I said, I know. But Ethan, I don't care about any of that. I care about you. And he said, I care about you too. but I don't want you to lose everything because of me. And I said, the only way I'll lose everything is if I lose you. And he said, Caroline, the first have $47 million in 2 months. I'll have more money than you. And I said, I don't care about your money. And he said, I know. But don't you see? The power dynamic shifts, everything changes. And I said, nothing changes. You're still you. I'm still me. And he said, but what if it does change? What if having money makes me different? What if I realize I don't need you anymore? And I said, then that's a risk I'm willing to take. And he said, why? And I said, because I love you and I want to build a life with you. Even if that life is messy and complicated and judged by everyone. And he said, you really mean that? And I said, yes. And he said, even if it means fighting my aunt, even if it means people talking, even if it means losing friends. And I said, Ethan, I already lost my husband. I already lost the life I thought I'd have. I'm not losing you too. And he started crying, and I held him, and he said, I'm so tired of fighting. And I said, then don't fight. Let's just be together. And he said, okay. And we stood there holding each other, and I felt something settle, something lock into place. And the next day, Margaret called me and said, I heard Ethan came to see you. And I said, he did. And she said, I said, I'm prepared to offer you a settlement, $1 million to walk away. And I said, no. And she said, $2 million. And I said, no. And she said, name your price. And I said, there is no price. I'm not leaving him. And she said, then I'll destroy you. I'll go to the press. I'll tell everyone what you did. And I said, do it. I don't care. And she said, you'll care when you lose your company, when your reputation is ruined. And I said, my reputation is built on 20 years of good. Work one scandal won't destroy that. And she said, you're underestimating how much people love to tear down powerful women. And I said, and you're underestimating how much I love your nephew. And I hung up and I told Ethan what she said. And he said, she's not going to give up. And I said, I know, but neither am I. And he said, what are we going to do? And I said, we're going to live our lives. We're going to be together, and we're going to let her do whatever she's going to do. And he said, that's terrifying. And I said, I know, but we'll face it together. And we did. Margaret went to the press, and suddenly I was on the news CEO, accused of manipulating young heir, and the headlines were brutal. Caroline Chen's twisted relationship, and is this love or exploitation? And my phone rang constantly, reporters, board members, and I stopped answering. I released one statement saying, I'm in a consensual relationship with Ethan Whitmore, and I won't be discussing it further. And Ethan released a statement saying, I'm an adult who chose this relationship, and I ask for privacy. And the feeding frenzy lasted 2 weeks, and then a new scandal broke, and people moved on. But the damage was done. My board asked me to step down temporarily while they investigated. And I said fine. And some clients left, and some friends stopped calling. And my daughter Amy called me crying and said, Mom, how could you do this? How could you date someone Marcus's age? Marcus was her husband. And I said, because I love him. Amy. And she said, that's not a good enough reason. And I said, it's the only reason that matters. And she said, I'm so disappointed in you. And she hung up. And that hurt more than anything. Because Amy was my only child. And now she wouldn't speak to me. But Ethan stayed. And in staying, he showed me that this was real, that he wasn't going anywhere. 3 months later, When the investigation concluded and cleared me of any wrongdoing, I stepped back into my role as CEO. But I also made a decision. I promoted my deputy to co-CEO, and I started working less, spending more time at home with Ethan. And he turned 25, and he accessed his inheritance. And the first thing he did was donate $10 million to homeless shelters and LGBTQ+ youth organizations. And the second thing he did was ask me to marry him. And I said, "What?" And he said, "I want to marry you, Caroline. I want to build a life with you officially." And one. I said, "Ethan, we just survived a scandal. Are you sure you want to do this now?" And he said, "I've never been more sure of anything." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "Okay." And we got married 6 months later in a small ceremony with just a few friends, and Amy didn't come. And Margaret contested the wedding legally, trying to claim I'd manipulated Ethan into marriage. But Ethan testified in court that he loved me, that he chose this, that he was happy, and the judge threw out Margaret's case and ruled that 2 consenting adults have the right to marry, regardless of age difference. And after that, Margaret finally let it go, and Ethan and I bought a small house in the mountains, away from the city, away from the judgment. And we split our time between there and my original house, and we built a life together, a quiet life, full of books and coffee and morning walks and late night conversations. And people still stare sometimes when we're out together, still whisper, still judge. But I don't care, because I learned that love doesn't follow rules or timelines or expectations. Love just is. And Ethan taught me that. And I taught him that healing is possible, that starting over is possible, that family isn't just blood family, is who shows up, who stays, who chooses you. And we chose each other. And if you're watching this and you've ever been afraid to love someone because of what people might think, or because it doesn't fit the narrative you're supposed to follow, I want you to know that the only narrative that matters is yours. And the only opinion that matters is the one you have of yourself. And I spent too many years living for other people, for David's memory, for my daughter's approval, for society's expectations. And when I finally chose myself, when I finally chose love, I found something I didn't even know I was looking for. I found peace. And if this story touched you, if it made you think or feel or question anything, leave a comment below and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to choose love. And it's never too late to choose yourself.